All right, hello again, everyone. So today is the first installment on our healthcare section. So we're looking at why we have a right to healthcare or arguments for that claim. And we're also looking at arguments for the claim that we don't have a right to healthcare. So this is Why We Don't Have a Right to Healthcare by Bernard Baumrin. Okay, so Baumrin starts his argument with two philosophical assumptions that are pretty plausible. First of all, it's number one um, is when we are obligated to do something, we have to be able to do the thing that we are obligated to do. So, for instance, um, you don't have a moral obligation to fly at this moment right now, right? If I say you have a moral obligation to fly, you'd be like, "What? I can't fly." That means that you can't be morally obligated to fly. So if you have a moral obligation, it means that you have to be able to do that thing, right? So this is the doctrine of ought implies can, and we saw that in Kant. So that's the first assumption. The second assumption is the correlativity thesis, right? And the idea there is that for every right that one has, there's a corresponding duty that falls on somebody else, right? Okay. So rights, duties, and ought implies can. So let's look at what I'm calling the typical formula for a right. Um, so A has a right to X against B in virtue of Y. So let's try and break that down a little bit. So A is a person. Let's say Albert. Albert has a right to something X. Let's say healthcare. So Albert has a right to healthcare against B, where B is the bearer of the right, right? The person who has to bear the duties to Albert, right? So we'll say that Albert has a right to health care against Beth in virtue of Y, where Y is a kind of justification, right? So we'll say that Albert has a right to health care against Beth in virtue of being a human creature, right? That's the kind of formula for a right, and we'll see this a little bit later on. So when we talk about rights, we're talking about people who hold rights, and we're also talking about other people who have various obligations based on our rights. So for instance, if I have a right to life, then that means that everyone else has a duty not to kill me, right? And they may also have a duty to say, protect my life or save my life if I'm in danger, right? Um, so rights always spawn duties for other people. And this is the correlativity thesis. Um, so for every right, there is a reciprocal duty. Okay. Okay. Um, we already talked about ought implies can. Ought implies can. The idea there is that if you have a duty, then you have to be able to fulfill that duty, right? And so if somebody has a right, then the person that bears the duties for that right must be able to fulfill those duties and fulfill those obligations. Okay, last thing we're going to distinguish is positive rights and negative rights. These may have come up earlier in the course, but if not, I'm going to go ahead and do a recap now. So a positive right means that we owe something to the right holder, right? So for instance, if I have a right to some of your money, that means that you have to do something. Give me some of your money, right? Suppose that we made a deal or a bet and I won the bet, all of a sudden I'm entitled or I have a right to some of your money, right? So that's a positive right. Whereas a negative right doesn't mean that the duty bearer has to do something for the person that holds the rights. Rather, the duty bearer has to refrain from doing something, right? So a positive right involves us doing something for the person who has the right, whereas negative rights involve us refraining from doing something to the person that has the right. So take, for instance, the right to life. If the right to life is negative, then other people owe it to me just not to kill me, right? Um, they don't have to save my life if I'm in danger, right? But they always have to refrain from doing things that would kill me. Whereas if the right to life is positive, then that means that um, if the right to life is positive, then that means that other people have to do things for me and like protect me or keep me from dying, right? So that's a big question. Is the right to life positive or negative? And the other thing is the right to life, or excuse me, is the right to healthcare positive or negative, right? So that'll be a relevant question. Um, okay, so I'm going to go back to this slide. So Baumrin proposes that there are three potential justifications for a right to health care. There might be a natural right to health care, a contractual right to health care, and a legislative right to health care. He's going to argue that all of these potential rights to health care are all don't work. They don't give us a right to health care, right? So none of these justifications justifies a right to health care. So that's an interesting conclusion. So why there's no natural right to health care? So this is his argument. So the first premise, natural rights produce only negative duties and create obligations that fall on everyone, right? So the idea here is that if you have a natural right, then it must also be a negative right, right? And a negative right is that other people simply refrain from doing certain things to you, right? So the idea there is that, look, if a natural right were to be positive, that would mean that everybody would have to potentially do that thing for you, whatever it is, right? Maybe save your life. But the thing is that some people can't save your life if given the opportunity, right? Suppose that somebody's handicapped in a wheelchair, or there's an elderly person, right? Those people literally can't meet that obligation. And so it has to be the case that natural rights are all negative rights and produce negative duties. Okay, so premise two, a right to health care would have to include the provision of something, right? So if I go to the doctor, right, he or she is going to give me medicine. He or she is going to give me various treatments. This person may give me a surgery, right? So healthcare always involves the giving of something else to someone. So premise three, a right to health care would create positive duties. Okay, so we're kind of seeing where this is going. So healthcare involves giving of provision and healthcare would create a positive duty. So premise four, the only people that can do something about healthcare are trained health professionals. Okay, so so the idea here is that, look, only people who can say, give me surgery or help me with this cold that I have, the only people who can surgically remove this cold from me are people who are surgeons, right? And so surgeons stand in a special and privileged position to give me the healthcare provision that I need, right? Okay, so premise five is, but not all persons are healthcare or trained healthcare professionals. This is clearly true, right? Because there are attorneys and there are philosophy teachers and there are students, right? So not everyone is a trained healthcare professional. So that means that not everyone can have an obligation related to healthcare if the right to healthcare is positive, which it has to be, right? And so it follows from that that healthcare is not a natural right. Um, so given that ought implies can, recall we're looking at premise 6, given that ought implies can, so people who aren't trained healthcare professionals can't give the kinds of services and provisions that other people need. That means that they can't be obligated to do that, given that they can't do it. So it follows that there is no natural right to healthcare. Okay, so next is the contractual right to healthcare. So when we look at this, think about the social contract theory stuff we looked at earlier, like Rawls, and I think we may have touched on some others, like maybe Locke in previous lectures. So the idea here is that rights and privileges are sort of created between contracts, between consenting parties, right? So that's premise 1. So if you and I agree on a contract and we both sign the contract, I may have some rights and you may have some rights that are held between us in virtue of that contract, right? Okay, so voluntary undertakings demand explicit consent on part of the contractor, right? So, so suppose that, you know, I have a contract and I want you to sign it, and I hold a gun to your face and I say, oh, you got to sign it. I start pressuring you, right? I'm threatening to take your life. That wouldn't be a voluntary undertaking. You would have been coerced in that instance. And so the contract would end up being void, right? So the idea here is that, okay, contractual rights demand explicit consent on part of the contractors. Okay. So consider in premise 3 the Hippocratic Oath. This is the oath that physicians and healthcare professionals take but just before they begin their careers, or maybe at the beginning of their medical school. At any rate, though, the Hippocratic Oath involves a pledge to help everybody that one can, right? It's more sophisticated than that, but that's basically the idea. So only some of the future physicians and healthcare professionals who take the Hippocratic Oath see themselves as explicitly consenting to fulfill some obligations, okay? So suppose that we have all of the doctors, right? And all of the doctors have taken the Hippocratic Oath. This premise is saying that just some of those doctors have seen the Hippocratic Oath as like a contract where they have an obligation, right? Not they all don't see it that way. So any contractual obligation relative to healthcare would have to be able to be fulfilled by only a portion of healthcare professionals, right? So if we take all of those doctors and we look at the set of doctors who see themselves as um, explicitly giving consent to a moral contract, right? Um, those would be the only people who could fulfill the contractual right to healthcare. The other ones that didn't take the contract very seriously, they're off the hook. So it's only this small subset of doctors who are obligated to fulfill the right to healthcare. Okay, if the right to healthcare covers all services, the set of those that would have a potential contractual obligation could not fulfill the obligation to humanity. So let's imagine that all people are in on the contract, right? And that our right to healthcare covers all services. If we take that small portion of physicians and doctors and healthcare professionals who explicitly gave the Hippocratic Oath as a moral contract, those people couldn't. There's not enough of them to fulfill the the needs of every single person, right? All of the healthcare needs of all of the people, like they just couldn't do it. Okay. If the right to healthcare, premise 6, if the right to healthcare covers only some services, it is still the case that the set of those that would have a potential contractual obligation could not fulfill the obligation for all of humanity, right? So we take the set of doctors who explicitly consented to the Hippocratic Oath, and then we say that, look, you don't have to do, say, brain surgeries, you don't have to do dental work, right? So you're only doing some services. It's still the case that those folks wouldn't be able to meet that obligation. Okay. Okay. 7 says that there cannot be a general obligation for all humanity to have health care provided. And this comes from premises 4, 5, and 6 in conjunction. And ought implies can. So recall, we have our subset of doctors who have explicitly consented to the Hippocratic Oath, and we said that they couldn't provide health care for everybody who has a right to health care, right? We said that they couldn't do all of the services and they couldn't do some of the services. So given that they simply can't do it, it follows that there is no contractual right to health care, right? Given the impossibility of being able to fulfill the obligation. I know this is a lot. There's a lot to look at. So if you're confused, do please email me. Okay. And lastly, we have an even longer argument, the legislative right to health care argument. The idea here is that I'm not going to walk through every premise, right? But rather the idea here is that um, states can create a right to health care, right? So so one thing is that a state or a nation can create rights for its citizens, right? So if I have um, the white walking man when I'm crossing the street, I then have a right to cross the street, right? And then my right to cross the street is everybody has a duty to respect that right while the white walking man is on the thing. So that is a legislative right, right? So it's not the case. It's the case that legislatures in different states can bear rights for people. So we might think that a legislature could have could grant a general right to health care for the population of a given state or nation. So the idea here is Baumrin wants to say is that there can't be a general obligation, or excuse me, a general right to health care for everyone, because each state can only grant its own citizens the right to health care. So if we want to say that, look, there's a right to health care that we all have. Look, it's so cool, right? If we're thinking about legislative rights, it's only going to be like per country. So the people in Mexico may have a right to health care, but the people in Brazil say don't have a right to health care, right? And so the conclusion of this argument is that there's no general right to health care for all of humanity. Okay, well, this is all 3 of Baumrin's arguments for why there's no right to healthcare. We looked at 3 different justifications for rights: natural rights, contractual rights, and legislative rights. And so we see that we don't have a right to healthcare. So our next video is going to be about why we do have a right to healthcare. And I hope you'll join me then and there.